Do you ever feel like something inside you has been lost, as if a part of you went quiet and no one noticed? You keep going, functioning, living, replying, but inside everything feels distant. And then comes the fear. Is there something wrong with me? Am I broken? But what if this silence you feel isn't a failure, but a form of protection? What if your soul isn't broken, just quiet? Deepak Chopra once wrote, "The soul is not wounded by circumstances, but forgotten in the noise." And that's what you're about to understand. But only if you have the courage to truly listen all the way through. There comes a moment when the body is still functioning, the routine still runs, the words still come, but inside something has gone silent. It's not sadness, not depression in a clinical sense. It's more subtle, like a part of you has gone into standby mode, as if the soul quietly has closed the door from the inside and is just watching, not intervening anymore. Most people panic when they feel this. They think they've lost their mind, that something broke inside, that they've lost their grip on reality. But what few people know or remember is that the soul doesn't scream. And when the noise of the world crosses a certain threshold, it simply withdraws. Not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Deepak Chopra wrote, "The soul withdraws, but never breaks. It goes quiet like a wounded animal that needs space. It stops speaking because it knows that words don't work when everything around is deaf." And in that silence, which feels empty at first, something new begins. The state of listening. But we were never taught to listen. We were taught to reply, to produce, to perform. Silence, in society's logic, is weakness. It's suspicious. It's uncomfortable. So when the soul goes quiet, we rush to fill the gap with anything. Activity, distraction, noise. But none of that reaches the center where the silence lives. Nothing from the outside can awaken what went quiet on the inside. That's why you can be surrounded by people on top of all your tasks and still feel absent from yourself. Because this absence isn't physical, it's soulful. It's like your body keeps saying yes, while your soul deep down is already whispering enough. That enough isn't rebellion, it's a calling to slow down, to reverse the flow, to come back home, inside. But that's scary. Because returning inward means entering a space you may have forgotten. A space where there's no performance, no audience, no pretending. And that's when many mistake this silence for collapse. But it's actually the opposite. The soul goes quiet to avoid collapse. It retreats as an act of preservation, like a seed resting underground in winter, holding its power. What seems like death is actually maturation. Depth psychology sees this as a kind of psychic withdrawal, meant to reorganize what's been fragmented. When external life becomes too out of sync with who we are inside, a subtle shutdown occurs. An inner distancing, meant to protect what's essential. It's what Carl Jung called the individuation process. The moment when everything false starts to fall apart so the truth can finally rise. But at first it feels dark, because you don't know what's being born. You only know what has stopped. And facing that not knowing is our biggest challenge. The mind wants control. It wants to label, understand, fix. But the soul's silence offers none of that. It only asks one thing, that you pause, that you listen, that you stay. Deepak Chopra says, the more noise you make inside, the less you hear the truth of your soul. It's a brutal truth, because it forces us to see ourselves, to realize how much we talk, even in silence, how much we demand, how much we resist, how often we pretend everything's fine when deep down, everything is asking for stillness. And this is where the soul starts to teach, not with words, but through sensations, that sudden lack of energy, the urge to withdraw from certain places, the loss of interest in things that once filled your time. None of it is random. It's a sign that something deeper wants to emerge. And to do that, the old must make space, but we were taught to resist. to maintain the image, to keep up the role. And each time we do, we drift further from our own inner voice, until it goes completely silent, and then comes what we call loss of meaning. But the meaning didn't disappear. It just moved to a different place, more subtle, more inward, more real. The problem is we try to find this new place with the same old tools, and that never works, because this isn't about figuring things out. It's about feeling, allowing, not reacting. The soul comes forward not when you force it, but when you make room for it. Have you noticed how everything real happens in its own time? A flower doesn't bloom before it's ready. A river doesn't rush just because you're in a hurry. The soul is the same. It speaks when it feels safe. It moves when it knows it's being heard. So if you're feeling this silence now, this strange pause between what was and what hasn't yet become, breathe. You are not broken. You're returning. After the soul goes quiet, the world keeps making noise, but you no longer react the same way. Some conversations feel hollow. Certain urgencies lose their weight. Environments tire you more quickly. You may try to go back to how things were, but something inside you just can't. It's not resistance, it's awareness. It's the sudden realization of how much you've been betraying yourself to meet the world's expectations. And so begins the second layer of silence. The body starts speaking on the soul's behalf. The soul doesn't use words. It speaks through the rhythm of your breath, the tension in your shoulders, the gaze that avoids, the anxiety that squeezes without warning. Each discomfort is a quiet message, but the mind, wired to fix everything fast, sees it as failure. And the cycle repeats. Something in you asks for rest. You respond with more effort, more hustle, more fight, until exhaustion forces you to listen. That's when you start to feel what you've long suppressed. The sadness you hid too seems strong. The fear you disguised as control. The anger you turned into a smile. These emotions are not problems. They are messengers, fragments of the soul trying to return home. And each one, no matter how uncomfortable, carries a truth you've been avoiding. Deepak Chopra speaks clearly about this. Every emotion, not heard, becomes inner noise, but when truly listened to, it becomes wisdom. And maybe that's the most important part of this phase, to understand that feeling is not weakness. It is return. It is presence. Most of us grew up learning to deny our feelings. We swallow our tears, pretend it doesn't hurt, hide our dissatisfaction, play our roles, and over time that becomes automatic. You no longer notice how far you've wandered from yourself until the body starts to break, until the soul goes silent, and the world loses its color, but the light isn't gone. It's just been buried under layers of protection, layers you built to survive, to adapt, to please. And now that those layers are starting to crack, what's emerging is sensitivity. Don't mistake it for weakness. Sensitivity is strength in its rawest form, because it feels what others run from. It sees what lies beneath words. It welcomes without needing to fix. This sensitivity returns when you allow yourself to feel without judgment, without needing to name it all, without needing to understand it fully. Just feel the honest discomfort, the silence lived with dignity. That's the ground where the soul begins to return, not with speeches, but with presence. You start to notice it in the details, the tears that come for no reason, the sudden nostalgia, the urge to be quiet even when surrounded by people. These aren't signs of imbalance. They are pieces of your soul asking for room to exist again. Don't try to control them, don't try to explain them, just feel. And the more you truly feel, the more the soul responds, not with grand revelations, but with small realignments. A deeper breath, a lightness after crying, a wordless embrace, a silence that doesn't weigh you down. The soul doesn't need spectacle, it needs space. Deepak Chopra says, the more you live in alignment with what you feel, the less you need to control what happens. And that's what begins to take shape now, a kind of quiet harmony where you no longer fight life so much, where emotions flow rather than explode, where sadness has its place but doesn't consume you, where anger is understood as a cry for respect, not an attack. Everything starts to make sense when you stop denying what you feel. And then, what once seemed like silence becomes language. What once felt like emptiness becomes listening. What once felt like pain becomes healing. Because the soul didn't come back shouting, it came back being. And to be at this stage of the journey is the deepest way to exist. But be mindful, this process isn't linear. There will be days when everything feels like it's slipping backward, when silence feels heavy again, when you question if you're still on the right path, and that's okay. This too is part of the listening. This too needs to be felt. The mistake is thinking that healing means never fluctuating again, when in truth, healing is learning how to embrace yourself, even in the fluctuations. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to erase your past. You just need to stop forcing yourself to be what you don't feel. Authenticity begins the moment you allow yourself to be whole, even in silence, even in doubt, even in stillness. And in that space, something transformational begins to happen. The soul starts to guide you again, not with certainty, but with sensation, not with promises, but with presence. You feel what resonates, you feel what weighs you down, you feel what frees you, and that's worth more than any plan. As the soul begins to return, you stop looking for meaning outside. You live the meaning through how you feel on the inside, a place no one can give you, and no one can take away. After crossing the silence, after listening to what had been quiet for so long, something within begins to shift. But this time, it's not a change driven by the mind. There's no agenda, no speech. It simply begins to show up in your way of being. You start to respond more slowly, speak less, listen more, and not because you decided to, but because the noise has lost its meaning. This new way of living isn't a rational choice. It's more like an involuntary realignment. Your body begins to reject what's false. Your mind loses interest in the noise, and your soul, no longer hiding, starts to touch everything you do. Even the simplest actions now carry presence. You cook with more care, you walk with more awareness, you breathe with more attention. The rush that once felt inevitable now bothers you. The background noise you used to tolerate now hurts. When the soul returns, it doesn't bring euphoria. It brings quiet, it brings lightness. It brings a calm kind of strength that no longer needs to prove itself. And that transforms your relationship with the world. What once drained you, you now observe from a distance. What once hurt you now reveals how much you allowed. And with that, a new kind of responsibility is born. To protect your own listening. To no longer place yourself in situations where your soul has to go silent, just to fit in. Deepak Chopra speaks to this when he says, the health of the soul depends on the coherence between what you feel, what you think, and what you do. And once you feel that coherence, you can't unfeel it. You may try to return to your old rhythm, but it will hurt, it will feel heavy. It may even make you sick again. Because now you know, the cost of ignoring what you feel is simply too high. In this new state, daily life takes on a different texture. You become more selective, not out of arrogance, but out of care. Care for your time, care for your body, care for your energy. You start to notice how much you used to give too much, speak out of obligation, smile for the sake of politeness, and slowly you stop bending. You start standing. But that isn't always well understood. Some people will drift away. Some relationships will unravel because what was held together by effort doesn't survive in silence. And that's okay, because now you no longer want relationships that depend on your absence to function. You want bonds that honor your full presence, With silence, with pauses, with truth, your intuition also starts to blossom, not as some mystical sixth sense, but as a gentle clarity that shows you what makes sense and what doesn't. You feel the room, you feel the subtext, you feel what's behind the words. This isn't a gift, it's the natural result of no longer running from yourself. And in that space, you begin to realize the more aligned you are with what you feel, the less you need to seek. Answers come. Situations resolve with more ease. What was forced fades away. What is true stays, because now you are available. And when you are truly available, life cooperates. Quantum physics calls this the collapse of the wave function, when the observer's presence influences reality itself. In simple terms, it means that the more centered you are, the more the world responds to your vibration, not to your anxiety. And that's why once you exit the state of inner noise, everything around you starts to reorganize. You no longer want to be everywhere. You no longer need to be accepted by everyone. You no longer chase being right all the time. You trade effort for listening. You trade performance for presence. You trade control for trust. And that doesn't make you passive, it makes you whole. Because now, instead of reacting to the world, you choose how to move through it. In this phase, the simple becomes sacred. A long shower, a quiet conversation, a cup of tea on the porch. All of it takes on new meaning. You no longer need constant stimulation to feel alive, because your inner life has begun to pulse again. And that's what nourishes you. Deepak Chopra teaches the silence between thoughts is the portal to creative intelligence. And that's the silence you now live in. Not an empty silence, but a fertile one. A silence where everything is possible, but nothing is forced. Where you observe, you feel, you act with less impulse and more intention. Of course, there are still challenges. There are still days of doubt, fatigue, and noise. But now, you know how to come back. You know how to breathe. You know how not to drown. Because you've learned to listen to your body. You've learned to recognize when you're losing yourself. You've learned to stop before you abandon yourself. And that constant listening becomes your base, your anchor, your internal place of safety. You're no longer so dependent on what happens out there because you've found something inside that no one can take away. Your own company, your own presence, your own truth. It's not perfection, it's alignment. It's not rigidity, it's respect, it's not isolation, it's autonomy. And it's here, right here, that the soul begins to expand again, not in defensive silence, but in creative silence. A silence that doesn't separate you from the world, but brings you back to it with more integrity, more peace, more life. Now that you've started to listen, maybe everything feels simpler and more challenging at the same time. Simple because you no longer have to pretend. Challenging because living in truth requires choices. Small choices, but deep ones. Saying no when you used to smile, stopping when you used to push, staying silent when you used to explain. And as natural as that sounds, it takes courage. Courage not to go back just to be accepted. Courage to stand by what you feel, even if no one gets it. Courage to stay with yourself, even when the world demands noise, speed, and performance. But now you know, every time you betray yourself, the soul goes quiet again. And every time you listen, with presence, it breathes again. This new state isn't something you show off. No one sees it. No one applauds it. It reveals itself in your pauses, in your softer gaze, in how you walk into a room, how you listen without hurry, how you leave without guilt, how you care for what you feel without having to explain it. This doesn't come from the mind. It comes from the soul. That. Now finally, trust you again. Deepak Chopra says, the soul doesn't need to be understood. It needs to be respected. And maybe that's the key to everything. Respect. Respect for your timing. Respect for your pain. Respect for the space you need to feel, because you've spent so much time trying to adapt that you forgot what it was like to simply exist, to just be, to breathe without tension, to be without needing to prove yourself, to feel without needing to apologize. And that is freedom, not the loud kind that demands and insists, but the kind that breathes gently, the kind that chooses, the kind that knows the value of what it feels, even when it's hard, even when it's nameless, even when no one else sees. This is the freedom that's starting to take shape now, not because you've arrived somewhere, but because you've stopped running from where you are. Life doesn't stop happening. The challenges still come, emotions still rise and fall. But now there's a space inside you that can hold it all with more wholeness. You no longer try to avoid pain at any cost. You no longer run from yourself. You feel. And through feeling you transform, without effort, without a plan, without rush. And with that, even time begins to change. You slow down without noticing. Mornings become more present. Nights ask for more quiet. Conversations become fewer, but more real. Life begins to move at the rhythm of the soul, a rhythm that doesn't follow the clock. It follows the breath. You begin to cultivate simple rituals, a slow cup of coffee, a shower with no distractions, a walk with no headphones, a candle lit before bed, a pause before you speak. It's in these small gestures that the soul blooms, because it doesn't live in the extraordinary. It reveals itself in the essential, and with time you begin to understand. There's nothing you need to chase outside. What you were looking for, peace, meaning, presence, was only waiting. For one thing, space. Space to exist, space to move, space to speak. And now that you've made that space, everything changes. But in such a natural way, you barely notice. You begin to trust yourself, not everything you think, but what you feel when everything gets quiet. And that's more valuable than any theory, because the soul doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be held. And when it is, it leads you, not with promises, but with direction. The direction of the soul is silent. It doesn't come with guarantees. It comes with a feeling of alignment. You know something is right, not because it's easy, but because it's true. You know it's time to let go, not because it doesn't matter, but because it's already done what it needed to do. You know it's time to stay, not out of fear, but because there's something real there. Deepak Chopra writes, "Inner wisdom is a whisper, not a shout, and that whisper is now becoming your compass." The needle no longer points outward. It pulses from within. And if you pay attention, you'll always know where to go, even if you don't know the destination. This kind of listening changes everything. Even pain begins to shift. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this showing me?" You stop reacting and start welcoming. You begin to see that you don't need to defend yourself from everything, that you don't need to understand everything, that you can simply be. Be with what is, with what pulses, with what moves through you, even when it's uncomfortable, even when there are no answers. Because now you trust time, and soul time is not mind time. The soul blooms slowly, but when it blooms, it transforms everything. You may not have all the answers, but you have presence. You may still feel fear, but you no longer abandon yourself. You may not know what comes next, but you already know who's in there, and that's more than enough. That's a seed, and seeds, when respected, know exactly when it's time to grow. So if today everything feels quieter inside you, this is not the end. It's the beginning of something more real. Your soul is not broken. It's just tired of all the noise. Breathe, stay with it a little longer, and let the silence show you what has no name yet. If this resonated with you, feel free to like, comment, or come back here whenever you need to listen. Again. We'll meet again in the next video.